Hello my friends, and welcome to part 2 of my FALL-OWEEN thrifted pumpkin makeovers. Today I'm doing this adorable little fairy house pumpkin, and if you missed part 1, which was my crow and sunflower pumpkin, I will have that linked at the end of this video so you can go watch that as soon as you're done with this one. Well, it is Create Day, so let's get started. This is one of the pumpkins I got from Goodwill. It's in great shape, and I can tell by how it feels and how it sounds when you tap on it that it is carvable. So, of course, it was perfect for this project. I just needed to give this lettering a light sanding, then clean it up a little bit, and it was ready for a base coat. I'm using white gesso for my base coat. Spray paint is also a good option, or you can just start in right away with your chalk paint. It just depends on the surface and how well you feel that the paint will adhere. I'm going to make a casting out of this IOD mold called Hidden Hollow. This cute little door. I'm using DAS air dry clay, pressing that into my mold. I usually apply cornstarch in my molds first. I have found that with some molds that don't have a lot of intricate detail, if you've cornstarched it once and then used it, you can usually get away with doing another casting out of it without re-cornstarching it. Once I roll that out, I'm going to dip my finger in water and go around the edges to make sure it's nice and smooth. Now I wanted to cut out the little window section on the door, so I'm using my X-Acto knife, and it was a little bit fiddly because it's super tiny. I didn't want to cut out the cross beam in the middle. I wanted it to still have those 3 separate little areas, so I just worked very carefully to get all 3 of those cut out. I'm using a embossing, I think it's an embossing tool. It has a little rounded knob on the end. Dipping that in water, I'm just using that to help smooth out those edges. Now I want to place this on my pumpkin so that I can trace around those little openings so I know where to cut a hole in my pumpkin, that this will fit exactly over where I want it to be. Once I have that traced on there, I can go ahead and make my first cuts with my X-Acto knife. Then I'm going to recheck that hole to make sure it's the right size by placing my mold back on there and then making any adjustments I need to get it to be the right size. I just want to make sure that the edges of that hole don't show through my little opening on the door. Once that opening was just the way I wanted it, I went ahead and glued down my door with some Titebond Quick and Thick glue. Be sure to check out the description box for a complete product list of everything I used in this video, along with affiliate links. I'm using DIY's paint in the color Crinoline to do 1 coat over the entire pumpkin and my casting. I always prefer to paint my air dry clay while it's still somewhat fresh. I find that it helps reduce cracking and shrinking, but you do have to be really careful that you don't distort any of the details in that casting. So you need to use a light hand and just take your time with it. I have these Tim Holtz window frames that I'm not using on this project, but I do want to use one as a template for the little windows I'm putting on either side of the door. So I'm just going to use that to trace out the opening that I want to make in my pumpkin. I use my utility knife to very carefully carve this out. With that one done, I did the same thing on the other side. For my second coat of paint, I want to add some texture. So I'm using that same color called Crinoline, and I'm adding baking powder. Usually we use baking soda for this, but I've used baking powder before just as an experiment, and I found that it makes it a lot fluffier. So I thought that might be a good choice for this particular project. So I just mixed in some baking powder. I had a little bit too thick, mixed in some more paint, and then it was the right consistency. I'm going to brush this on and then stipple it up into the areas around that casting to help fill in any gaps. And then I will do the same thing with a different brush around this pumpkin. This one is more of a kind of an oval shaped, I think it's like a waxing brush. And I'm like just kind of brushing that on and then going over it in a stippling motion. And then I will go around that door again with a small, very small round brush to again fill in any little gaps around the door. When that was all dry, I gave the entire pumpkin a coat of my DuraClear matte varnish. This will seal in that clay-based paint and enable me to add different paints and finishes without reactivating the clay paint. I'm going to paint my door with a base coat of traditional burnt umber. I do 2 coats of this over the entire door, carefully painting around that top and side and bottom edges that fit right up next to the pumpkin. And I'm going to use this same color to draw in all those little recessed grooves on the pumpkin. Then I'm going to wipe that back before it dries. I just want to establish some shadowing in those sections. It took me several steps to get it the way I wanted it to look, but this was a good way to start, just getting some of that color down in there, wiping it back so that it's not so stark of a contrast. Next color is Woodsy Smoke. I am painting this on over the lines that I just did, but I'm also extending it out beyond that and then wiping that back so that I'm hoping to get this graduating sense of dark to light as we reach the raised edges of the pumpkin. So that's the look I'm going for, and it just takes me several steps, several tries to get the effect I want. But I'm going to show you this whole process so that you'll be able to take away whatever works for you or doesn't work for you. Next up is Fusion's Mineral Paint in the color Chateau. I'm going to water this down and apply this over everything and then wipe it back. I'm hoping to just kind of haze out all those lines that I just did. I don't want them to disappear. I just want them to be pushed into the background. Now, anywhere that the paint didn't come off as much as I wanted it to, I just added a little spritz of water and then wiped it back again. This almost got me to the look that I wanted, but not quite. So I do have one more step I do a little later on. At this point, I decided I wanted to go ahead and drill a hole in the bottom of my pumpkin for my tea light. I'm using this Milwaukee hole dozer that you attach to your screwdriver or your impact driver, and it makes the perfect hole, especially in these little foam pumpkins. It just cuts like butter. My sweet dad got me a kit of those when he saw me struggling with making a hole on a previous project. I just thought that was the sweetest thing ever, and it totally came in handy for this one. Now I'm just going to sand that down a little bit to smooth it out. And I did the same with the windows and then paint the inside of that so that it matches the rest of the pumpkin. Now I'm using Fusion's Raw Silk. I'm going to do kind of a dry brush over the raised areas of the pumpkin, just kind of highlighting that, making them a little bit lighter. Now back to the door. I'm going to do some dry brushing on there as well. I'm starting with the color mushroom, and I will graduate up to some lighter colors, but I just want to highlight all those little raised details on this door, making it look aged and weathered. I made these resin castings from the IOD Toadstool Mould, and I used amazing casting resin. Didn't get footage of it, but you've probably seen that a million times anyway. And I'm going to go ahead and give all of these 2 coats of that traditional burnt umber. Now I'm going to be dry brushing these as well, starting out with the color mushroom. Now before I glue my mushrooms on, I want to finish up those little grooves in my pumpkin to get them just right. I'm using Dixie Belle's Van Dyke Brown Glaze to lightly brush on into those grooves and then wipe it back. And that ends up giving me just the right amount of darkness and depth to, I don't know, just to make me happy, I guess. It's like, there's no right or wrong. Like, it's just what makes you happy. So now it's time to attach our little twigs to our windows. I just cut up little pieces of twigs, and I'm super gluing them on around the little windows. Now it's time to add my mushrooms, and I'm using super glue to attach those as well. Now mine were still somewhat flexible. I think maybe my mixture wasn't just quite right, so they weren't rigid, and they glued on just fine. If your castings are completely stiff and they won't bend, you can heat them up with a heat gun and bend them to fit around the curved surface. Now it's time to address this stem. We're going to make this much bigger and better than it is. I'm starting off with some of this wire. I'm going to use it to build my armature for my new stem. I've got a piece here that's about 18 inches long. I'm going to fold it in half, stick the 2 ends into my screwdriver, and then start twisting it. And I felt that it was too hard to hold on to get a good twist. So I stuck a pencil in the end loop and then twisted it that way. And I was able to get a nice tight twist on this so that I could use this to make my stem. I went ahead and bent this into the shape that I wanted beforehand. Sometimes you can insert this first and then bend it to the shape you want. I thought it was easier to do it this way. Now I want to insert this into the top of that existing stem, but I couldn't get it to push down in far enough to adhere. So I'm going to drill a small hole, and then I can insert that wire into there and then secure it with some hot glue. The next step is to build this up with some aluminum foil. So I'm just taking strips of that and wrapping this around, forming it into the shape that I want, trying to make it look like, to me, my vision was like a old crusty tree branch. And so I just wrapped this around until I got the basic shape that I was going for. And by the time this is done with all the layers of texture and whatnot that go on here, it ends up looking really good. So it really doesn't take any skill to build this, you know, out of the aluminum foil. You'd be surprised at how good it looks just with minimal effort on making it look like a tree branch. I'm going to secure that aluminum foil down with some hot glue, and then we can move on to the next step, which for me was Mod Podging some coffee filters on here. You can also use air dry clay. There are just so many ways you can do this. You can wrap this in masking tape and then cover it with tissue paper or whatever. I chose to just tear up these coffee filters and start Mod Podging them on here. They're thicker than tissue paper, so I felt like that was a good base for this. Like it would help cover up that aluminum foil really well. And it ended up turning out great. But there are several steps here. I don't just do the coffee filters. I get all of these on here, and then I go in with toilet paper because I want to be able to add more wrinkles and whatnot. And the toilet paper is really thin, so you put that on there, and then you can kind of smoosh it so that it wrinkles up, and it just gives it more texture, which I really like. So this is the method I chose. It's not necessarily what anybody has to do. It's just what I chose to do. So again, it's just the same process as with the coffee filters. Mod Podge, toilet paper, more Mod Podge. Then I had one more layer I wanted to do, cotton balls. I love the effect that these give on a project like this. So I had jumbo cotton balls that I unrolled. I'm just spreading some Mod Podge on there and then stringing this around, getting it to adhere, and gluing it down. And it just adds this really neat organic texture that, I don't know, like I use this on my skeletons and skulls and stuff for Halloween. Cotton balls are amazing when it comes to texture on things that you want to look kind of creepy. So I'm going to cover the entire stem with bits and pieces of cotton and then cover that all up with Mod Podge. When that was dry, I painted it with DIY's layered chocolate. Now, of course, I need to add some color to this brown stem. I'm starting with yellow ochre. I'm going to brush this on in sections and then wipe it back with a baby wipe. I need to be careful with the amount of moisture that I'm transferring onto that with the baby wipe because that DIY paint is not sealed and I don't want to reactivate it and lift it up. Next up is a color called Forest Moss. I'm adding these and then wiping them back so that they don't overpower. But then I'm going to be adding a brown on top of that. So I'll have that dark brown underneath and little hints of the yellow and the green poking through. Now comes the bark brown for the final color. I did water this down a little bit so that it doesn't completely cover up my other colors. And now for the finishing touch on this stem, I'm going to do some dry brushing, of course. I'm starting out with the color Mushroom, and then I will go in with the color called Oyster Beige. So now it's time for some moss. And I also had this bark that I picked up, and I thought, oh, I could break this into little pieces and add that in with the moss, but I ended up not doing that. But that's okay. I'll save those for another project. The mosses I'm going to use, I have this one that's on a roll, and it's like connected with small wires. I'm going to cut that up. And then this is just a brown natural moss, and I have this green preserved moss. And then I also have the spongy, I don't know what this kind is called, but it's really spongy. So with this first one, I'm going to go ahead and cut this into some strips, and I'll be hot gluing this on to the bottom of the pumpkin all the way around the pumpkin. So now I'm going to add in some of the different types of mosses, and I'm using the Beacon Fabri-Tac glue for this. I find it's easier to just squirt that onto my pumpkin and then lay a little dab of moss into it and let it just adhere that way, instead of using hot glue with these other pieces of moss that are a little bit more spread out. It just works better for me, but you can use whatever glue works for you. I'm adding a little bit of that dark green moss around the pumpkin stem, and then I'm going to be putting on that brown natural moss to go around the stem. And once I get that on there, I go ahead and add in a little bit of the other mosses just to blend it all together to go with the mosses that are around the other part of the pumpkin. Now I had these little wooden mushrooms. I can't remember if these were Hobby Lobby or Dollar Tree, but I'm going to give these a couple of coats of my dark brown paint and then dry brush on a lighter color called Woodsy Smoke, and then I will dry brush over that with mushroom, and then lastly the Oyster Beige. I'm going to use my Gorilla Super Glue Gel to glue these onto the top. However, I should have just gone with hot glue because with that moss on there, it stuck really well, but they weren't steady. They could still kind of wiggle around because the moss wasn't completely glued down in every spot. So once that glue set up, I did go back in and reinforce underneath those little mushrooms with the hot glue. So I'm just going to brush off any excess moss that was loose with my hand and give this a final little trim job. And lastly, I'm going to make this little hang tag. It's really simple using this transfer from IOD's Very Merry Christmas. I'm just going to transfer that onto one of these tags that I got from Amazon. Using my transfer tool, I get it transferred on, remove that carrier sheet and burnish it, and then just stick some twine through the hole at the top. I just poke that hole back through, sand off the edges, and that's it for this little hang tag. Well, thank you so much for watching today. Let me know what you think of this project, and be on the lookout for part 3, which is this cute little steampunk pumpkin. I hope you find my content useful, will like and subscribe, but more importantly, I hope I've inspired you to go create something. See you next time.